The conference room on the 42nd floor smelled like expensive leather and broken promises. Charles Moore sat with his hands folded on the mahogany table, watching dust particles dance in the afternoon light that cut through floor-to-ceiling windows. Beyond the glass, the city sprawled like a circuit board, millions of lives interconnected, unaware that in this sterile room, 21 years of loyalty were about to be incinerated in less than 5 minutes. CEO Richard Pemberton stood at the head of the table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his Tom Ford suit immaculate. Beside him sat his daughter, Victoria Pemberton, 28 years old with an MBA from Yale and exactly 14 months of real-world experience. Her smile was practiced, corporate, the kind that appeared in business magazines under headlines about disruptive leadership. "Charles," Richard began, his voice carrying that particular tone of false warmth that executives reserved for terminations. "We've decided to take the company in a new direction." Charles had built the acoustic dampening technology that made Pemberton Industries a leader in architectural sound design. He remembered the late nights in the lab, the failed prototypes, the eureka moment at 3 in the morning when he'd finally cracked the molecular structure that would allow buildings to breathe while maintaining perfect silence. His patent, filed under the company's name per his employment contract, had generated $400 million in revenue over the past decade. "Victoria will be taking over as Chief Innovation Officer," Richard continued. "We need fresh perspectives, younger minds." Charles looked at Victoria. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Her manicured fingers tapped against her leather portfolio, a nervous gesture that betrayed her composure. "I've trained 17 engineers," Charles said quietly. "I've mentored half your R&D department. The Singapore project will be handled by Victoria's team," Richard interrupted. "We're grateful for your contributions, Charles. Truly. But technology evolves. Leadership evolves." The word grateful tasted like acid in the air. Charles thought of his daughter's college tuition paid off last year. He thought of his wife Margaret's 40th birthday, when he'd missed dinner because Richard needed the Dubai presentation ready by morning. He thought of the patent clause, Section 7, subsection 3, buried in his employment contract like a landmine waiting for the right pressure. "The severance package is generous," Richard said, sliding a folder across the table. 6 months' salary, full benefits through year-end, and of course, a letter of recommendation. Charles opened the folder. The numbers were insulting. 6 months for 21 years. He'd made this company indispensable in the luxury construction market. Hotels from Shanghai to Stockholm used his technology. Concert halls, recording studios. The Metropolitan Opera had his signature dampeners in every wall. "There's one more thing." Victoria spoke for the first time, her voice smooth and rehearsed. "We're finalizing an acquisition deal with Resonance Global. $890 million. Closes in 3 weeks." Charles's heart accelerated. Resonance Global, the Chinese-American conglomerate that had been courting Pemberton Industries for 2 years. He'd sat in on early negotiations, back when Richard still valued his input. "Congratulations," Charles said flatly. "We'll need you to sign off on the technology transfer documents," Richard added, producing another folder. "Standard procedure. Your patents will be included in the acquisition portfolio." There it was, the reason for this meeting's timing. They needed him compliant, grateful for the severance, willing to sign away any complications before the deal closed. Charles saw the architecture of his own destruction clearly now. They'd waited until the acquisition was imminent, until they had maximum leverage, until refusing would seem petty and vindictive. But they'd forgotten something, or perhaps they'd never known. Charles had read his employment contract 17 times over the years. Most employees signed on page 34 and never looked back. But Charles had been careful, methodical. Section 7, subsection 3 stated that if the primary patent holder was terminated without cause within 24 months of a major acquisition, said patent holder retained the right to withdraw licensing authorization for any patents filed during their employment. It was a relic from the company's early days, when Pemberton Industries was a scrappy startup and employment contracts were drafted by overworked paralegals. No one had bothered to update the language. It existed in every senior engineer's contract like legal archaeology. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I'll need time to review the documents, Charles said. Richard's jaw tightened. It's a formality, Charles. Don't make this difficult. Difficult. Charles stood slowly, his chair scraping against Italian marble. I've given you 2 decades. I've made you wealthy, and you're replacing me with someone whose greatest achievement is being born into the right family. Victoria's face flushed. That's inappropriate. What's inappropriate? Charles said, his voice gaining strength. Is erasing someone's legacy 3 weeks before you cash out. What's inappropriate is pretending this is about fresh perspectives when it's really about nepotism and convenience. Richard's expression hardened into something cold and corporate. Security will escort you out. Your personal items will be shipped. Charles picked up the Ensign technology transfer documents. I'll have my lawyer review these. You'll hear from me in 48 hours. As he walked toward the elevator, flanked by 2 security guards who'd once asked his advice on their son's engineering school applications, Charles felt the weight of 21 years lifting and transforming into something sharper, more dangerous. He thought of Section 7, Subsection 3. He thought of $890 million evaporating because of a clause no one remembered. The elevator doors closed on Richard's face, his expression shifting from anger to something that looked almost like fear. Charles drove home in silence, his hands steady on the wheel despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. The suburban streets of Maple Ridge looked the same as always: manicured lawns, basketball hoops and driveways. The coffee shop where he'd spent countless Saturday mornings sketching designs on napkins. Everything familiar, everything stable, everything built on the foundation of a career that had just been demolished. Margaret was in the garden when he pulled into the driveway at 3:15, hours before his usual return. She looked up from her roses, shears in hand, and knew immediately. 23 years of marriage had taught her to read the topology of his silences. They let you go, she said. Not a question. Charles nodded. Inside the house, he poured coffee he didn't want and sat at the kitchen table where his daughters had done homework, where Christmas mornings had unfolded, where life had happened in the margins of his obsessive career. Margaret sat across from him, waiting. Richard's giving Victoria my position, Charles said. They want me to sign off on the technology transfers before the resonance deal closes. Will you? Charles looked at his wife. Her hair was graying at the temples now, her hands strong from years of garden work and physical therapy sessions for the knee injury she'd sustained while he was in Tokyo for a conference. She'd built a life around his absences, never complaining, always understanding. He'd promised her that the sacrifices would be worth it, that loyalty mattered, that good work was rewarded. There's a clause in my contract, he said slowly. If I'm terminated within 24 months of a major acquisition, I can revoke my patent licensing. Margaret's eyes widened. The acquisition would collapse. $890 million. Gone. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the wood grain of the table. What are you going to do? Charles thought of his younger self, fresh out of MIT with a head full of dreams and algorithms. He joined Pemberton Industries when it was 30 employees in a converted warehouse. He'd worked 18-hour days, missing his eldest daughter's birth because he was debugging code in Seoul. He'd believed in something then, the purity of innovation, the nobility of building something that mattered. Richard Pemberton had been different once. Scrappy, hungry, willing to listen. They'd shared beers in the parking lot after late nights, talking about changing the industry. But success had calcified him, turned him into the kind of man who saw people as assets to be optimized or eliminated. I built that technology, Charles said. Every iteration, every improvement. My name might not be on the press releases, but it's in every line of code, every material specification. And they're erasing me like I never existed. You don't owe them anything, Margaret said firmly. Not after this. But Charles thought of the engineers he'd mentored. Jonas, who'd struggled with imposter syndrome until Charles had spent 6 months building his confidence. Priya, whose acoustic modeling had been brilliant but needed refinement. They'd be caught in the crossfire. If the acquisition collapsed, jobs would be lost. Not Richard's. He'd walk away wealthy regardless. But the people who'd worked alongside Charles would suffer. That evening, Charles sat in his home office surrounded by framed patents, industry awards, and photographs from conferences in 12 countries. He pulled up his employment contract, reading Section 7, Subsection 3 for the 18th time. The language was clear, unambiguous, a legal nuclear option. His phone buzzed. A text from Jonas. Heard the news. This is bullshit. We're all sick about it. Then Priya, you taught me everything. They can't just throw you away. Then Marcus, the head of manufacturing. Building's not the same without you. Let us know if you need anything. Charles realized that his legacy wasn't the patents or the technology. It was the people, the knowledge he'd shared, the culture he'd built, the standard of excellence he'd maintained. Richard and Victoria could take his office, his title, his name on the org chart, but they couldn't take what he'd actually created. A team that knew their worth, that understood quality, that wouldn't accept mediocrity just because it came wrapped in nepotism. He opened his laptop and began typing. Not the angry email his lizard brain wanted to send, but something more strategic. He reached out to David Chun, his patent attorney, a meticulous man who'd helped him navigate intellectual property law for years. The response came within an hour. Read your contract. Holy shit. Call me tomorrow morning. We need to talk strategy. Charles slept poorly that night, his mind racing through scenarios. If he triggered the clause, Resonance Global would walk. The deal would collapse. Pemberton Industries stock would crater. But Richard would learn that loyalty wasn't optional, that people weren't disposable, that 21 years of dedication couldn't be erased with a severance check and a handshake. Morning came too quickly. Charles stood in his driveway watching neighbors leave for jobs they'd return to tomorrow and the day after. Their employment secure, their contributions valued. He thought of calling Richard, offering one last chance to make this right. But he knew how that conversation would go. Richard Pemberton didn't reconsider decisions. He doubled down. Charles got in his car and drove to David Chen's office, the city awakening around him, oblivious to the corporate earthquake about to reshape everything. David Chen's office occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building where Charles's acoustic technology lined every wall. The irony wasn't lost on him as he sat across from the attorney. Contract pages spread between them like evidence at a crime scene. They're idiots, David said, shaking his head. This clause should have been scrubbed from employment contracts a decade ago. The fact that it's still active in yours? It's a corporate liability waiting to happen. Can they fight it? They can try. But the language is airtight. Termination without cause. Check. Within 24 months of major acquisition. The Resonance deal hasn't closed yet, so check. Right to withdraw licensing authorization. Check. Charles, if you pull this trigger, their $890 million deal evaporates. Charles looked out the window at the city below. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Richard Pemberton was probably in a meeting, confident that Charles would sign the documents like a good soldier. Victoria was probably designing her new office, planning her press announcement, imagining herself on the cover of Forbes. What happens to the employees? Charles asked. David's expression sobered. Short term? Chaos. The acquisition was going to bring capital, new projects, stability. Without it, Pemberton Industries takes a hit. There might be layoffs. But long term, he leaned back in his chair. Companies that mistreat key personnel don't deserve acquisition windfalls. And maybe Richard needs to learn that actions have consequences. Charles's phone had been buzzing all morning. Word had spread through the company. Engineers were angry. The operations team was demoralized. Even people from other departments, marketing, finance, HR, were reaching out. Some offered support. Others warned him about retaliation. A few, afraid for their jobs, urged him to sign the documents and move on. But one email stood out. It was from Helen Vasquez, the head of HR, sent from her personal account at 6:30 in the morning. Charles, what they did to you was unconscionable. I argued against it. Richard wouldn't listen. Victoria's not ready. She doesn't understand the technology or the team culture. I can't say this officially, but you should know you're not the first. Richard pushed out Tom Bradley last year before he could vest his stock options. He restructured Linda Kwan's department to justify her termination. He's becoming someone I don't recognize. Whatever you decide to do, you have more support than you know. Charles forwarded the email to David. I need you to document everything. Every termination, every suspicious restructuring. If I'm doing this, I'm doing it right. Over the next 24 hours, Charles became an investigator of his own company's darkness. He reached out to Tom Bradley, who'd been the CFO before being replaced by Richard's golf buddy. Tom shared documents showing how Richard had manipulated quarterly reports to justify his termination, denying him stock options worth millions. Linda Kwan, former VP of Operations, revealed that she'd been pushed out after questioning cost-cutting measures that compromised safety standards. Her departure had been framed as a voluntary resignation, but the reality was far uglier. He's turned Pemberton Industries into his personal kingdom, Linda told Charles over coffee at a downtown bistro. Merit doesn't matter anymore. Only loyalty. And loyalty means silence. Charles compiled everything into a folder that grew heavier with each edition. Employment contracts, termination letters, internal memos that contradicted public statements. A pattern of behavior that revealed Richard Pemberton's true character. A man willing to destroy careers to protect his bottom line and advance his daughter's unearned ascension. On the third day after his termination, Charles received a call from Richard himself. "We need to talk," Richard said, his voice tight. "My attorney tells me you haven't signed the technology transfer documents." "That's correct." "Charles, don't be foolish. This deal is important. Not just for me, for everyone at the company. 230 employees depend on this acquisition going through. Those same employees watched you fire me after 21 years. How many of them feel secure now? How many are wondering if they're next?" Silence on the line. Then, "This is business. Nothing personal." "Everything is personal, Richard. Every person you terminated. Every family affected. Every career destroyed because it was convenient for you. You made it personal when you decided people were disposable. If you trigger that clause, you'll never work in this industry again. I'll make sure of it." Charles felt remarkably calm. "Is that a threat?" "It's reality. You're angry. I understand. But torpedoing this deal helps no one. Not you, not me, not the employees you claim to care about. You should have thought about that before you replaced me with someone whose primary qualification is sharing your DNA. Victoria is qualified. Victoria has an MBA and a trust fund. I have 2 decades of innovation. I have patents that made you wealthy. I have relationships with every major client we serve. And I have a contract that you never bothered to read carefully." Richard's voice dropped, gaining an edge. "Name your price. You want a bigger severance? Stock options? A consulting contract? We can negotiate." This, Charles realized, was who Richard had always been. A man who believed everything could be bought, every problem solved with money, every person reduced to a transaction. "There's no negotiation," Charles said. "You made your choice when you fired me. Now I'm making mine." He hung up. Within an hour, Richard's attorney called. Then the head of Resonance Global's legal team. Then a venture capitalist who sat on Pemberton Industries' board. Everyone wanted to negotiate. Everyone wanted to find a middle ground. Everyone assumed Charles could be reasoned with, persuaded, compensated into silence. But Charles had spent 3 days talking to people Richard had discarded. He'd seen the wreckage of careers, the families impacted, the psychological toll of being erased after years of dedication. And he'd realized something fundamental. If he didn't stand up now, the pattern would continue. Richard would keep treating people as expendable. Victoria would learn that cruelty was an acceptable management style. And the culture Charles had spent 2 decades building would corrode into something unrecognizable. That evening, Charles sat down with Margaret one final time. "If I do this," he said, "there's no going back. Richard will come after me. The industry might blacklist me. We might face legal battles. Margaret took his hand. You've always told our daughters that integrity matters. That doing the right thing isn't always doing the easy thing. They're watching. The engineers you mentored are watching. Everyone Richard has ever mistreated is watching. What are you going to show them? Charles thought of his younger daughter, Emily, who'd called that morning from college. She'd heard about his termination through social media. Someone had leaked it, probably Victoria's PR team spinning the narrative. Emily had been furious, ready to march into Richard's office herself. "Dad," she'd said, "you taught me that bullies don't stop until someone stands up to them." Out of the mouths of 20-year-olds came crystal clarity. Charles sent the letter on a Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock, time to arrive just as Pemberton Industries' executive team gathered for their weekly strategy meeting. The letter was formal, legal, and devastating in its simplicity. Dear Mr. Pemberton and Pemberton Industries Board of Directors, pursuant to Section 7, Subsection 3 of my employment agreement dated March 14, 2004, I hereby withdraw licensing authorization for all patents filed during my tenure, effective immediately. This action is taken in response to my termination without cause on October 7, 2025, occurring within the 24-month window preceding your proposed acquisition by Resonance Global. This withdrawal includes patents US 88473992, US 9234871, US 9876543, and 14 related acoustic dampening technologies currently licensed to Pemberton Industries. All licensing agreements are hereby null and void. Sincerely, Charles Moore. David Chun had delivered copies simultaneously to Richard's office, the board of directors, and Resonance Global's legal team. The reaction was immediate and explosive. By 10 o'clock, Charles's phone was ringing continuously. He ignored every call except one. From Marcus in manufacturing, who was laughing so hard he could barely speak. "Charles, you magnificent bastard. The executive floor is in total meltdown." Richard just smashed his phone. Victoria's crying in her office. The Resonance team pulled out of the building 30 minutes ago. It's beautiful chaos. Charles felt no joy, only a strange sense of completion. He'd spent 21 years building something meaningful. Now he was watching it collapse, but the destruction felt necessary, surgical, like removing infected tissue to save the healthy organism beneath. By noon, the story had leaked to the press. Tech industry blogs picked it up first, then mainstream business media. Pemberton Industries' acquisition in jeopardy after patent dispute, read one headline. Fired engineer torpedoes $890 million deal, declared another. The comment sections were brutal, with industry professionals taking sides. Some called Charles vindictive. Others called him heroic. Most agreed that Richard had mishandled the situation catastrophically. At 2 o'clock, Helen Vasquez called from her personal phone. "Charles, I need to tell you something. I'm resigning. I can't work for Richard anymore, not after watching what he did to you. But before I go, you should know half the engineering department is updating their resumes. Priya already has 3 interviews scheduled. Jonas is talking to competitors. Richard's losing more than the acquisition. He's losing the institutional knowledge that made this company successful." "I never wanted that," Charles said quietly. "You didn't cause it. Richard did. You just forced everyone to see what he'd become." By the end of the week, Resonance Global officially withdrew from the acquisition. Their statement was carefully worded, but the meaning was clear. Without Charles's patents, Pemberton Industries wasn't worth $890 million. The company's stock price dropped 32% in a single day. Richard called one final time, his voice raw with fury and something that sounded like desperation. "Are you happy now? You've destroyed what we built together." "We didn't build it together," Charles replied. "I built the technology. You monetized it, and then you threw me away. What's destroyed isn't the company. It's the illusion that you valued anything beyond your own profit." Victoria is learning a hard lesson about consequences. Maybe it'll make her a better leader someday. But right now, she's sitting in an office she didn't earn, leading people who don't respect her, cleaning up a disaster your ego created. Richard hung up without another word. The aftermath rippled outward in unexpected ways. Tom Bradley and Linda Kwan both reached out, inspired by Charles's stand. They were exploring legal action for wrongful termination, armed with the evidence Charles had compiled. Other former employees came forward with their own stories of Richard's mismanagement. 3 board members resigned, citing concerns about leadership culture. An activist investor began pushing for Richard's removal as CEO. The company that had seemed invincible just weeks ago was hemorrhaging credibility, stock value, and talent. But Charles also heard from people he'd never expected. A professor at MIT wanted to use the case in her business ethics class. A journalist from the Wall Street Journal requested an interview. A competitor offered him a position, Chief Innovation Officer, double his previous salary, equity package, and a guarantee that his contributions would be valued. "We've been watching Pemberton Industries deteriorate for years," the CEO told him. "Everyone knew Richard was burning through talent. We just didn't know how to prove it. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You exposed a systemic problem in how our industry treats its most valuable assets, the people who actually build things." Charles took a week to consider the offer. He walked through Maple Ridge, thinking about the last 21 years. The sacrifices, the victories, the slow erosion of principles in favor of profit. He'd believed that loyalty would be rewarded, that excellence mattered, that good people won in the end. He'd been wrong about the timeline, but not about the principles. 3 months later, Charles stood in a different conference room with a different view, but the same sense of purpose that had defined his career. Venture Sound Technologies occupied a renovated factory building in the city's innovation district. Exposed brick, industrial lighting, and an energy that reminded him of early Pemberton Industries before success had corrupted its soul. Marcus had followed him. So had Priya and Jonas. 12 engineers from Pemberton Industries had made the jump, bringing their expertise and Charles's mentorship culture with them. They were building something new, not acoustic dampening technology, which remained Charles's intellectual property even if he couldn't currently license it, but adjacent innovations in sound engineering that danced around the patents while pushing the field forward. "We've got meetings with 3 major hotel chains," Marcus reported during their morning stand-up. "Everyone wants to work with the team that revolutionized architectural acoustics. Your reputation means something, Charles." Richard couldn't take that away. Pemberton Industries, meanwhile, was in freefall. Richard had been forced to step down as CEO after the board lost confidence. Victoria had resigned quietly, taking a position at a family friend's investment firm where her inexperience would be less conspicuous. The company was being broken up and sold piecemeal. Its value diminished, but its employees scattered to places that might appreciate their talents. Charles felt no satisfaction in their destruction, only a quiet certainty that justice, slow, imperfect, but inevitable, had arrived. Helen Vasquez had joined Venture Sound as their head of people operations. Her first initiative was creating an employment contract with crystal-clear language about termination, equity, and intellectual property rights. "No one should ever have to do what you did," she told Charles. "But if someone must, the rules should be transparent." The Wall Street Journal article had run, sparking conversations across the tech industry about how companies treated senior employees. Charles had been interviewed on 3 podcasts, spoken at a conference panel, and received messages from engineers worldwide who'd faced similar betrayals. He'd become, somewhat reluctantly, a symbol of resistance against corporate disposability. But the most meaningful impact was smaller, more personal. Emily had changed her major from finance to engineering. "I want to build things that matter," she told Charles. "Like you did. But I want to do it at a company that values people. Maybe someday I'll work for you." Margaret had started a garden consultation business, something she dreamed about for years but never pursued while Charles's career consumed their lives. "Watching you start over gave me permission to do the same," she said. "We're both growing new things now." Tom Bradley and Linda Kwan had settled their lawsuits with Pemberton Industries, receiving compensation and public acknowledgement of wrongful termination. The settlements were modest, but the vindication mattered more than the money. On a cold evening in January, 6 months after his termination, Charles received an unexpected email from Victoria Pemberton. The subject line read simply, "I'm sorry, Mr. Moore. I've spent the last 6 months thinking about what happened. I want you to know that I knew it was wrong. I knew you deserved better. But I was afraid to speak up, afraid to disappoint my father, afraid to acknowledge that I wasn't ready for the role he gave me. I've learned more from this disaster than I did in 2 years at Yale. I learned that titles don't create leaders, that privilege isn't the same as competence, that the people you step on during your climb will remember, and their memory has power. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that your stand changed me. I'm working now at a place where I started at the bottom, where I have to earn every promotion, where my last name doesn't open doors. It's humbling and necessary. I hope Venture Sound becomes everything Pemberton Industries should have been. Victoria." Charles read the email twice, then forwarded it to Margaret. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think people can learn. Not everyone does, but some do. She's young. Maybe she'll be different." Charles typed a brief response. "Thank you for your honesty. Growth requires courage. I wish you well." He meant it. 2 years later, Venture Sound Technologies employed 87 people and held contracts with clients across 4 continents. Charles had licensed his original patents carefully, selectively, to companies that aligned with his values. The revenue funded research into accessible acoustic technology for schools and hospitals in underserved communities. Richard Pemberton had retired to a beach house in San Diego. Charles occasionally saw his name in business articles, usually as a cautionary tale about leadership failure. The Pemberton Industries name had been absorbed by a larger conglomerate, its identity erased more thoroughly than Charles's had ever been. Charles stood in Venture Sound's lab, watching a young engineer named David troubleshoot a prototype. David had emailed him a year ago, a recent graduate inspired by Charles's story, asking for a chance to learn. "Try adjusting the resonance frequency," Charles suggested. "Sometimes the solution isn't force. It's finding the natural harmony." David's eyes lit up as the adjustment worked. "How did you know?" 23 years of failure and persistence. That's the secret, staying curious, staying humble, and never mistaking a title for wisdom. That evening, Charles drove home through familiar streets to the house where this chapter had begun. Margaret was waiting with dinner and stories about the community garden she'd helped establish. Emily called from her engineering program, excited about an internship. His younger daughter, Sarah, sent pictures from her architecture firm, designing buildings that would someday use acoustic technology to create spaces where people could think, rest, and dream in perfect silence. Charles thought about the conference room where Richard had erased him, the moment when loyalty had shattered, the choice he'd made to stand rather than accept erasure. He thought about the clause that had saved him, not just legally but spiritually, a reminder that sometimes the smallest details contain the greatest power. His phone buzzed. A text from Jonas. "New project approved. We're building the future. Thanks for teaching us to fight for what matters." Charles smiled. The legacy wasn't patents or revenue or headlines. It was this people who'd learned that their work had dignity, that their contributions mattered, that they didn't have to accept being disposable. Outside, the sun set over Maple Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new innovations, new stories. But tonight, Charles Moore sat in the home he'd built with years of sacrifice, surrounded by the evidence that standing up, even when it cost everything, was always worth it. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.